This podcast is brought to you by PLI, the Practicing Law Institute. PLI is committed to keeping you ever current on the dynamic trends shaping the legal world. Learn more at pli.edu/ftpod.
Welcome to Fast Tracked, Emergent Issues in the Legal Profession, brought to you by the Practicing Law Institute. I'm your host, Jen Leonard, founder of Creative Lawyers. Buckle up as we hit the gas and explore the most dynamic trends shaping the legal world. I hope you'll join us as we explore the future of law today. Welcome, everybody, to another great episode of Fast Tracked, PLI's podcast about all of the emerging trends in the legal profession. My name is Jen Leonard. I am the founder of Creative Lawyers and your host on this show. And I am so delighted today to be joined by somebody I know you will learn so much from, because I had a chance to learn a little bit from him recently, and he is just a trove of knowledge and wisdom about the legal profession. I'm delighted to welcome you, Richard Jolly. Richard Jolly is an organizational consultant and clinical professor at Northwestern Kellogg School of Management. How are you today, Richard?
I am very good. Thank you, Jen, and very happy to be here. This is my favorite topic to talk about.
Same. I'm very excited to talk with you about it a little bit. And the topic that we're really talking about today is everything across the private sector legal landscape, particularly law firms. And I'd just love to start off, Richard, by just getting your sense of what you're seeing in the law firm landscape. What are the biggest drivers of change? And then we'll dive into a little bit of more particulars on how some of those dynamics will play out over the years ahead.
It's such a fascinating time for the legal profession right now, because if you go to any partner at any good law firm and you say how things are going, they'll say, I'm incredibly busy, I've got a full book of business, pipeline of future matters is great, charging out at good rates, very good rates, the world is a good place. If you go to any head of law firm and you talk to them, they say these are transformational times. And I think for me, that's a really important disconnect here, because if you're running a law firm, trying to persuade your partners that we need to change is never easy. And why I love working with law firms and in-house counsel, of course, as well, is that from my point of view, from the business of law, these people are a complete nightmare because they're super, super smart. I've got some great stories, which I won't share now. I've got some great stories of just how different attorneys are to any other group I work with. Just so that sort of cognitive capability is just spectacular. They're very well paid. And as a colleague of mine says, telling a bunch of millionaires that they're doing things wrong and they need to change is never a good conversation. And they do very important work and are world-class, very good at arguing, and therefore world-class at resisting change. And this is the thing, is if you're a partner and you're doing great work right now, then there doesn't seem to be a particular problem. But if you're in the business of law position, looking across the law firm and looking into the future, I think there's a whole bunch of issues here. One, of course, is pressure from clients, from GCs in particular. And what I find consistently from GCs is they're looking to work with fewer law firms. And some of them are increasingly under pressure to get more for less. The whole procurement function, which, to be honest, for most other professional service providers, other than law firms, has been an incredible pressure. If you take, for example, ad agencies, the profit margins have been slashed from 16, 17, 20% down to 3, 4, 5% because of procurement. So the pressure really hasn't hit law firms in the way that it has other professional providers. So wanting to work with fewer law firms, and obviously some of them putting pressure for a whole bunch of different reasons, and building many firms building larger in-house legal teams for a whole bunch of reasons. Obviously, ALSPs is something that gets talked about a lot. All of these different FFAs and different ways of paying for work. Obviously, there's something here around the big four firms who are having another go at trying to be the one-stop shop professional services for their clients. There's this whole thing of working from home and the challenges of getting attorneys and business service professionals back into the office. But perhaps probably the biggest challenge that I find in my conversations with law firms is that there's a generation entering the legal world today, these Gen Zs, who are, if you talk to any HR director, who are a problem. And so a colleague of mine did a study recently on them that found that this is a generation that assumes they won't stay with the same firm for more than 4 years at any point in their career. And so I was talking to the head of one of the Magic Circle law firms in the UK recently, who said, yeah, we know this. They are leaving after 3 or 4 years. The problem is it takes 6 years of us investing in a trainee before they actually become profitable. And so why has loyalty to the law firm, particularly big law, why has that eroded and to some degree seems to be evaporating? And there's another statistic from that same study, which is that 72% of these Gen Zs said that they do not aspire to be like their partner. And so I was talking to a partner in a client firm of mine, and she said, Richard, I know this. Last week, I was giving an appraisal to one of my associates. In the middle of the appraisal, she pointed a finger at me and said, I don't want to be like you. She said it was like a dagger to my heart. And I was talking to the head of a Chicago-based law firm about this just before the holidays. And he said, this is a generation that don't want the life that I love, that for me is incredibly rewarding. And so I think that this whole thing about not, attracting talent is an issue, but retaining that early and mid-career talent. I think that there's a fundamental shift here that is not a linear process. And, some partners say, well, when they settle down and have families, then they'll and there's a fantasy that somehow this is going to change. Now, I think we also need to be careful here. We don't do what I call the Richard Susskind effect and say, oh my God, everything's changing. You're doing it all wrong. And because whenever you mention someone like Richard Susskind and, who does come up with these quite provocative assertions about how law firms are getting it all wrong, every lawyer just rolls their eyes and goes, yeah. Now, if you talk to Richard Susskind, he'll say, well, yeah, but a lot of what I predicted was right. But I think it's important that we don't say, oh my God, law firms are doing everything wrong, everything is changing. But because if you're a partner in the average law firm, that's not what it feels like. But for a whole bunch of these reasons, and the list could go on, I do think that if you're trying to actually look at the future of how can we, as Wayne Gretzky said, skate to where the puck will be as a law firm, then it's very, very different from being a partner in the firm.
So everything you just said, there's so many different ways we could go with everything that you just said. And it sort of goes to your point of the challenges of being a chair of a firm and trying to figure out which of these dynamics to tackle. But I wanted to go back to the very first thing you talked about, which is the different perspective between a chair and the partners who are generating revenue for the firm. And first, I'd like to ask if you'd agree that the partnership structure itself makes these organizations very, very unusual and difficult to lead because everybody who is a partner or owner has a say in how the business is run. But also at the same time, why, even though that may be the case, there is such a different perspective and vantage point when you're in leadership as compared with when you are head of a practice group.
It's such a wonderful question, Jen. And law firms are very different. Now, let's just stand back and think generally. I've been teaching organizational change in the academic world at London Business School, Columbia, and now at Kellogg for the last over 26 years. And there's, all firms struggle with change. And it's not, the key thing I would say generally about change is not simply an intellectual problem. Because if we just think about our personal lives, and here we are, in the start of the new year, many people are making New Year's resolutions. There's an assertion I'd make that all of us, there are things in our lives that we know we should be doing differently. Yeah. And that's the New Year's resolutions list, well, at least part of it. And we're just not doing them. So telling somebody you should in their personal life or in their professional life, these are things you should be doing differently. Well, we kind of know that already intellectually. The problem is it's only partly an intellectual challenge. It's also an emotional challenge. And that is particularly an issue when you get into professional services. But just to be clear, I used to, I do a lot of work with big four firms as well. And big four firms used to talk about professional service firms and law firms and accounting firms is what we used to call them. If you call the big four firms accounting firms, first they get very angry. But secondly, because they do way more than just accounting. But secondly, the fundamental difference here is that all of the big four have over 300,000 people, some of them over 400,000. Accenture has over 750,000 employees. And if you think, for a really large law firm, how many partners they have or just generally employees, we're talking about something completely different. And in fact, I think for me, the more appropriate analogy for law firms is more like academic institutions, because the one area that is harder to change is academic institutions. And because being a bunch of academics who have tenure, and as we say, are not exactly looking to embrace radical change very often, is not easy. And we may touch on law school.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Richard.
For example, of that in a bit. But so this is the psychological profile of an attorney. What is different for attorneys is three things. Well, two of them are different to pretty much anyone else. And one of them is not different, but between them, this is the sort of trifecta that means that change in law firms is much harder and more challenging than any other environment. So the first characteristics is what we call high skepticism, because to be an attorney, you need clearly to be thinking about what could go wrong. Secondly is what we call low long-term resilience, which is they don't like change. And thirdly, which they share with other professionals and other senior managers, is high narcissism. And the combination and the way that Keith Campbell, the top academic on this topic, describes narcissism is this sense of grandiosity. He says that sort of the attitude here is, if I ruled the world, it would be a much better place. And so this is the personality type that whatever you're talking about, they think that they're smarter than anyone else and could do it better than anyone else, which again is very relevant, I think, for partners in law firms. So that's the sort of one of the aspects of why change is so hard, is because they don't like change. They're very good at arguing, as I said. And so there's an incredible conservatism that's baked into it. But there's another issue here, which for me is a very systemic issue to the design of law firms. And it's not just the partnership structure. It's the fact that the partners who are actually running the executive committee, whatever it's called as a group, if you talk to them, they, in my experience, consistently say, yeah, we know that there's change and we need to change. But this is a group of people who are typically, say, 2 to 5 years away from retirement. And all the things we're talking about here, and particularly generative AI, whether it is going to take 40% of the work law firms do, whether that's going to be done by AI or not, we don't know. But it's certainly going to be it already is a fundamental shift. And so this management group, they say, yeah, we know things are changing, but all the areas that are changing are not areas where they have expertise by definition. And so the temptation to just delay making decisions, to kick the can down the road, as you might say, and just basically do nothing about it is I think, very, very powerful. And there's a philosopher called Isaiah Berlin, who just over 70 years ago wrote a paper where he said there are two types of people in the world. And he used an animal metaphor for each of these people. He said there are some people out there who are hedgehogs. And hedgehogs, in this metaphor, are good at one thing. Yep. So we curl into a ball. And as a defensive strategy, this has allowed hedgehogs to survive and thrive for many thousands of years. And so these are people in their careers, the hedgehogs, who have developed an incredible depth of expertise. And clearly, in a law firm, you don't get to partner unless the core thing here is your technical competence, that incredible depth of hedgehog expertise that you've developed. But the problem is this. Increasingly, I would argue the key trend and the key challenge for law firms is you can't just rely on having lots of really smart, hardworking partners, associates, and trainees in order to be successful. Because the second type of person that Isaiah Berlin talked about are the foxes. And the fox is agile. It's able to adapt to very different situations. So you have the desert fox living in some of the most arid desert conditions on the planet, the Arctic fox hunting under the snow. I mean, lived in London, in England for many years, a huge urban fox population. Foxes have adapted to pretty much every terrain on the planet. And so here's the thing. The challenge is there are some attorneys who are never going to be foxes. They're just brilliant hedgehogs. But actually, at the top of law firms, we need people who are open to change. And how you get those people there and how you help them develop that capability to really think and be open to change and to really innovate, given all of the systemic and structural and, if you like, psychological barriers to that, that's why helping law firms change is, as I said, my favorite topic.
So recognizing how hard it is structurally for all the reasons that you talked about, and I'll add a couple more, and you can let me know if you think that I'm wrong about these, is the sort of short-term focus on profits in an annual cycle.
Yep.
And the buy-in from the equity partners really limits your ability to invest in long-term projects and the technology you need to really innovate. And I would say the other major issue, in addition to all the other things you've outlined, is the fact that if you need these people to change, your partners or your associates, but their job is to bill as much time as they can to keep generating revenue, and change is hard and requires time. How do you possibly square that circle and help people find the time? Because the other piece is right now, if I'm a chair, I'm so worried that my competitor firm, my peer firm, is going to poach an entire practice group or my biggest revenue generators because I'm asking people to take their foot off the gas and invest time in the long term. So how do you advise chairs, executive committees to start grappling with change once they even decide which of these dynamics they want to actually focus on in a way that doesn't risk losing their biggest breadwinners?
That is such a great question. There's no simple answer to that. I think it's a very complicated issue, which has so many elements. But you're absolutely right, Jen. These are such fundamental issues. And the short-termism that is baked into the whole structure of the firm is clearly not something that's going to change anytime soon. I think there's two things I'd say. Number one is the probability here is that most law firms aren't going to change until they hit a crisis. And because, as I said, the world is going pretty well for most partners today. And, rates have been going up and up and up. And whether that's sustainable or not is a question that I'm constantly asking attorneys what their point of view is. And I think certainly for the top end of big law, I think that probably is sustainable. But whether we're going to have some corrections there or not is going to be a fascinating one.
I was only going to interject there to say, Richard, that rates are going up, but the number of aggregate billable hours is falling, right? Which seems troubling, but I'm sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. And so exactly. I mean, you can, again, there's incentives, and what we call incentive alignment here. Billable hours is something that, and we mentioned FFAs before, and, whether that's actually going to get some traction here in the short term, I don't think it is. Some firms, some practice groups have do more of that than others, but it's still not I don't see a huge wave of changes in how law firms are billing for their work. So I think that most law firms are going to wait until there is a crisis before they change, because that's the easiest time, because it's sort of change or die. And I'm not sure there's a crisis coming. Again, I'm not doing the Susskind effect and trying to say Armageddon is coming here. But I think that what is going to happen here is that there will be more pressure from LSPs. There will be, the big four firms in particular are really looking at these great rates that law firms are charging and want some of that. And there's some pretty smart people at some of these big four firms. And of course, all of the big four have large numbers of attorneys on their books as well. And these are very well-managed businesses. I'm not perfect. Again, they're professionals, but they're very well-managed businesses compared to the average law firm. And again, when I say well-managed, just simple things like the number of law firms who aren't managing the operational side of things in an efficient and effective way is, for me, something I still find surprising. Given that, if you want to be more profitable, then, making sure you do invoice for all the things you should invoice for, and making sure you negotiate appropriately. The number of operations directors and other business services professionals who are just incredibly frustrated. The partners just won't give them any real access to clients or to really do their jobs. So I think that's going to be a lot of inertia. There is the reality. But the simple answer to the question is, if I was advising chairs of law firms about this, which is a large part of what I do in my advisory work, my answer is don't take this head on. This is not what I'd call a sort of walls of Jericho, blast the trumpets and the walls come tumbling down approach to organizational change. I think the key thing here is to find areas of traction that are easier, where you can really find specific practice groups, specific partners, particular clients, where you can start getting traction. So doing experiments, doing small changes, where you aren't forcing everyone to do things against their will, is a much more powerful way of actually exercising change. And there's a lovely scene that I'm always reminded of when I talk about this from a wonderful comedy, My Big Fat Greek Wedding. I don't know if you've seen it, where the hero, Tallulah, is complaining to her mother in tears that her father won't let her go to college. And he's the head of the family. And her mother says to Tallulah, he may be the head of the family, but I'm the neck, and I can move the head any way I want. And I think my advice to heads of law firms is, don't be the head, be the neck. And the subtle, indirect ways of getting change that are so much more meaningful and effective.
I love that. I definitely remember that analogy. And speaking of incentives, maybe we could move earlier in the career pipeline for lawyers and talk about those Gen Z attorneys that are coming into big law firms. And you and I both talked to law firm leaders, really giving them agita about a lot of different things. And I think the formula, to your earlier points, used to be throw a huge salary at somebody very young coming out of law school, give them great training, give them the, potential someday to own equity in the firm. And as you said, around year 6, they will start becoming profitable, and you can then select the ones that you want to actually own the future of your firm. And those incentives worked for a really long time. And when you were talking about the partner who says, well, when they buy a house, things will start changing for them. And I think that's sort of this myopia of looking at everything through the lens of your own experience. And you and I work with younger people. They came up in a world completely full of tumult and chaos where institutions collapsed around them. They don't feel the same type of security when they join an organization. And I think that has somewhat shaped their worldview as a generation to overgeneralize in a way that makes that statement, I don't really think align with the way that they view the world around them. And so how do you create different incentives when money is not going to be the thing that's going to solve it? The prospect of equity partnership, which is diminishing anyway, is not something that they want. And in my experience, a lot of them want a brand name and some training and some experience so that they can find exit options and go do something that that aligns more with their purpose and their mission. So how do you create new incentives and new alignment for that generation?
Again, it's not simple. There's no simple, but if I focus on one thing, one piece of advice, one gift I'd give to senior, heads of law firms and partners generally, to try and actually help them be more effective at it, the gift I would give them would be the gift of listening. Because this, I think, is the key issue. Exactly as you said, Jen, there's an assumption here that we see the world through our own lens. We just assume that everyone sees things the way we see the world. And what we're seeing now, and we see it in academia, by the way, MBA students, just the last 2-3 years, my experience is what they expect, the demands they're making, and I've been doing this for over a quarter of a century, are radically different to anything I've seen before. And I have to say that at Kellogg, we are pivoting very dramatically in how we teach as a result of it. So I think we're very much at the cutting edge of this. But if you don't get on top of this, then what we see is that the Gen Zs are the most stressed generation we've ever studied, the least loyal generation, and they don't know exactly what they want. But what they do know is they don't want the same things that the previous generation really wanted, which is big office, nice car, nice house, work very hard to really, juicy, intellectual, cognitively demanding work. And that pretty much is the life. And what's interesting about it is this isn't radically different to what most of us want, because I think all of us want to be able to do intellectually interesting work and have some balance in our life. But right now, the traditional law firm model is not geared up to give people that balance. And so smaller law firms, there's one in particular I work with, which is actually saying, come here, we're going to make sure you have a great life. And they are doing really well. They are, winning lots of new mandates. They are attracting some really high quality lawyers from some of the most, the top big law firms who say, you know what, just I'd rather earn a little bit less money and actually work in a healthy environment where it's fun and be able to choose, have much more control about how I work, because stress, more than anything else in our working lives, is related to how in control you feel of the work that you do. So that's why they're so keen to take more control. So the gift here, if you're in a management position, is you got to listen. And if people don't feel listened to, then that just increases their alienation and their desire not to come into the office and to be less loyal. And there aren't any simple rests here about how law firms need to respond. It depends so much on the size of the law firm, type of work that they do, where they're based, etc. So, but listening to them, not just to gather the information about what matters to them, but to make them feel valued. And I think that's one of the big risks for law firms right now is, given most law firms that I speak to here in the US say that it's really hard to get people in more than 3 days a week. And you can try and mandate it. And there's one big firm that mandated it. And when I spoke to the head of the firm 6 months later, she said, well, no, did I say that? No, I don't think I said that. And they've really sort of wheeled back very quickly on any demands that they're making because people are just going to leave. So listening is the simple answer here. But I think the key thing that if you're in a senior position is you need to take time as a management team to really stand back and think about how we create an environment that actually people really want to be here. And how you solve that is not going to be you. It's a conversation, hence the listening, where we actually figure it out together.
I love that point about smaller and mid-sized firms. I see the same thing. And even, I remember advising students when I worked with law students on where they would go, for their first firm. And everybody's looking for culture, but nobody can define what culture means. And I'm sure you see this, like culture is more appealing to me when you walk into a firm and you can tell that the partners know one another, that they care about one another, that they want to come and pursue something together. And you can definitely feel the opposite where people are transactional and they're there to make money. And I think to your point, most human beings want to be in the first kind of organization, but it leads into another area I really want to hear your thoughts about, which is mergers, because it seems to me that the huge benefit these smaller firms have is their culture and their ability to create sticky lawyers. But then the economics are forcing them to merge with other firms, making them bigger and have more unwieldy cultures and brands. And how do you see that playing out? Because I think it's a shame for those firms to have to lose that piece of it. But I understand the pressures that they're under.
Yeah, there's data on this, which is there's a famous, anthropologist. I'd say famous. He's famous if you're an anthropologist, called Robin Dunbar, who did analysis of the human brain. And what he found is that the average human being, in terms of the number of active, stable social relationships they can manage, there's a number there, which is 148. And what you find is that throughout history, human beings have lived in communities of around 150 people, wherever they are geographically. We have this core unit because you know everyone, you trust everyone, you help each other. Once you get beyond 150 people, that trust breaks down. That sense of community breaks down. So when you get large cities, clearly you get all these social problems. But that's how we live our lives today. So when a law firm gets beyond 150 people, then you don't know everyone. Before then, you know everyone. You know their names. You may not even know what's going on in their lives. So I think that there is, I absolutely agree with you, Jen. There's a very strong cultural sense of cohesion with small firms. But when you get beyond a certain level, it just will evaporate. And so you need to professionalize, have systems and processes. You can't just walk into the partner's office or, the head of the law firm and say, hey, I have an idea. So I think but yet because clients are actually demanding that they want to work with fewer law firms, actually there's enormous pressure here to be the one-stop shop, to be able to have the scale where you can deliver your clients' legal needs. And so that, I think, is I think, increasingly going to be a polarization. So I completely agree. There's enormous pressure for law firms to do these mergers and to scale up. The problem is, of course, that once you get that scale, particularly in a post-merger environment, what the data shows is that 70% of these mergers destroy value. And they just don't work very well because on paper they look good in terms of practice groups and geographies or whatever, or client types. But are we really spending enough time on the post-merger integration? And the answer is, in my experience, absolutely not. So if you are going to merge, you have to spend time on the post-merger cultural integration. Otherwise, it's not just going to manage itself. And yet, if you talk to partners and say, is this something you really want to spend time on? The answer is absolutely not. So, but I've worked with law firms here and in the UK who've been through major mergers. Some of them have gone incredibly well, and some of them have been incredibly challenging. But it's not a strategic issue that's the problem. It's the cultural problem of, are we actually spending enough time to build those trusts, to try and recreate the dynamics you get in a community of 148 people? You can do it. You've got to work at it.
Is there a pattern you see, Richard, as comparing the effective mergers culturally with the ineffective ones? Is there something magical that they're doing that would help the others?
Well, I mean, you say magical. I mean, it's pretty simple, which is actually spend time focusing on how can we make the relationships work. And this is the key thing. And this is my point about Fox versus Hedgehog, is it's not simply about technical expertise here. There was a time when you could get a whole bunch of really smart attorneys together and do really well. Increasingly, you've got to focus not just on that, what we call human capital, that knowledge and expertise, that hedgehog capital, you might say. You've got to focus on the social capital. And that, if there's one sort of shift that I see here in successful law firms, it's not simply relying on human capital and our expertise, and actually acknowledging and spending time on building relationships. Mm-hmm. And that's what the Gen Zs want.
Well, speaking of the Gen Zs, I want to end our conversation where they are beginning their careers, which is in law school, the place that is tasked with equipping them with the skills and knowledge they need to start their careers effectively. I want to go back to your earlier point because I say the same thing all the time. All of the challenging dynamics that you see in a law firm that make change hard are amplified on a law school campus or any campus of higher education for the reasons you talked about. So do you think legal education is structured in a way that makes it capable of changing to meet the moment? And then the follow-up to that is, what would that change look like in a law school curriculum or a law school structure?
This is a topic, I actually wrote a piece about this a few months ago. I find law schools to be the least innovative places I've really ever come across in almost 30 years of consulting, because there's just no incentive to change. You're a professor, you've been teaching this stuff for 25, 30 years, you know what to do, you've got your ways of teaching it. There is very little incentive to change. And you've got tenure, so basically people can't force you to change either, because what you're doing is certainly technically valid. It's like doctors, many surgeons who are still doing particular interventions that are somewhat out of date, but they're not going to change. But way, way more extreme in the legal world, because where I've seen change happen in law schools is not from the top, it's from the bottom. And I'll give you an analogy here, not from the law school, but from Kellogg. Because Kellogg, 2 years ago, I put every exam question, every assignment I give my students into ChatGPT. And it took probably half an hour to do all of it. And in that half hour, suddenly I realized my entire academic life had changed, because it gets an A every time. And I believe they put the New York bar exam into ChatGPT, and I came in the top 10% of all the students. And so everything has changed. You cannot assess them. You can't police generative AI, and we're never going to be able to police it. So what we've done is there was a young professor, a colleague of mine, who basically said, well, I'm just going to try experimenting using ChatGPT to help enhance the learning of my students. And he piloted it, and it was incredibly successful. We're now rolling it out across the school literally this week. And now, before each class, the student goes onto our portal. We use Canvas, and says, "Okay, what do I need to study this week?" And it tells him, and it's just a wonderful use of Gen AI. But also, rather than giving them general assignments or exams, what we now do is we say, the system knows a lot about each student. And we say, okay, you just had a lecture on this particular topic. Given that you want to have a career in venture capital in California, how is this going to be relevant? And the student has a conversation with the AI. And then what we do is really grade the insight they brought to that conversation. So rather than actually trying to police it, we're leaning in and actually using the technology here. And the point I want to make here is not just an example of what it means to be a fox in a academic environment rather than a hedgehog, but this came from a junior professor, somebody who just experimented. And I think if you're running a law school, the challenge for you is to find these people and make sure they have enough oxygen that they don't get pushed out by the hedgehogs.
I love that. And I love the innovative approach to thinking and treating AI as a co-intelligence, which I think is how our future lawyers will use AI, not like a standard tech tool, but really as a partner. And one of the things that I was optimistic about at the dawn of the Gen AI era is the idea that you could have more highly customized, easily accessible education. I remember in law school, you would prep for the final exam by going to the library and seeing a sample exam from a student the year before and be tasked with figuring out what made that so exceptional. It's so self-executing and also very intimidating. So the idea of having not only, like you're saying, engaging with the AI to strengthen whatever it is you're working on, but having different modalities and different ways of educating. We did for another project, I uploaded some of my first year Civ Pro cases into Notebook LM and had it create a podcast discussing the cases across one another. And I'm not saying that that's a substitute for reading the case, but I know as a first year law student, I would have understood what we were talking about much more by having the ability to work through it in that format before class.
My younger daughter, who's 15, long story, but she went into Algebra 2 without having done Algebra 1. They just booted her up a year for math. And last term, at the end of every class, she would have a few things she didn't understand. She'd go onto ChatGPT and basically say, teach me how this works. And so she basically, over the period of the term, got from not understanding any of the core concepts of algebra to doing very well in the class. And at the end of the year, there were a couple of things she didn't understand. So we arranged a couple of coaching sessions with a tutor. She said to me, Daddy, the tutor, it was great. She was just like a human ChatGPT. So for her, ChatGPT is how she learns. And this is a human ChatGPT rather than ChatGPT being some sort of lesser thing. And the fact that that's sort of, and I teach a leadership class to undergrads at Northwestern now. And the first thing they do when you give them a problem is put it into ChatGPT. And so this is the thing is, this is a generation who are learning in very, very different ways. And it's so exciting. And if we don't actually lean into it and embrace it, then I think some of these law schools are going to start looking very, very dated. Just as some of the business schools are starting to look a little bit dated with their slightly, should we say, old-fashioned ways of teaching.
I'm so delighted to hear that you and your colleagues at Kellogg are thinking innovatively and creatively about how to prepare your students for the future. And I'm hopeful that law school leaders will do the same as the world continues to evolve around us. And I want to thank you so much, Richard. We could talk for hours. You are just have such depth and breadth of knowledge of this industry. So thank you so much for spending your time educating all of us a little bit about the dynamic times we live in.
An absolute pleasure.
And thank you to everybody for joining us on this episode. We will see you on the next episode of Fast Tracked. Have a great day. I hope you enjoyed this fascinating conversation as much as I did. Visit pli.edu for more insights, education, and resources for navigating this dynamic landscape. And until next time, stay curious and stay adaptable as we work together to chart a course into an exciting future.